All right, thank you for sticking around and for your attention. I'll try to move through this as quickly as I can, but like I said, it's really important that you see the rationale behind all of this. So you know it's not just something pulled out of a hat, for example. So first, if you weren't able to get to the presentations on Palm Sunday, let me just give you the really brief background how we got to this point. We were founded in 2016. The Archbishop gave us a school to build. That's our first project. We began to campaign with that, so we reached about 200 families, did very well with that first portion of the campaign. And then the pandemic hit, and there was great uncertainty. We were kicked out of Madison Place, had to go out to Gardner. We lost quite a few families in doing that. So there was a desire to get something of our own so that we wouldn't be dependent upon the local school district as to whether or not we'd have Mass. And so the thought was, well, let's construct a parish hall. That would likely be less expensive, maybe we can get it up quicker, and it would serve our immediate needs. So that was pursued, only to find that it was going to be about a little over $1 million less than what a school was going to cost to build. So that was not foreseen, that it would not be that much less expensive. So that was the first thing, but the campaign pursued with that as its principal or first building project. And that was extended to 550 families of the parish. That was kind of called the second phase of the campaign. That happened shortly before I got here. But the results came in just about when I arrived, and we had about 30 families participate out of the 550. So immediately what that told us is, well, we can't go forward. We don't have the funding to be able to go forward. And maybe we missed something. There was lots of uncertainty about this. When I announced at my parish I was coming here, I had a family come up to me and said, we thought they were calling off that parish, is what we heard, because our kids are in that parish. I said, well, that's going to be fun. So there was great uncertainty. So, the equation had changed, had shifted quite a bit. Okay, so a different building project, that could be a factor. The uncertainty of the pandemic, that could be a factor. But then this building we've been blessed with, that became a factor, right? So all of a sudden we had a place to worship in and a place for offices. And so I just thought, to do our due diligence, we needed to explore, what maybe we missed or where people are at and such, and partly just to kind of gather the troops and develop a sense of identity and a sense that, hey, we're not going anywhere, we're here. And so we've been doing this past year, but I reached out to the bishop and said, hey, could we discern which project we believe we should build first and then propose it to you as a recommendation? And he said, sure, you can do that. So it's very unusual that a parish would be able to do that. So that gave rise to the exploratory committees that we formed. So in December, I invited everyone from the parish, if they wanted to volunteer. And the exploratory committees were set up for church, school, and parish hall. I had not heard a whole lot of groundswell interest for the parish hall. And so I said, if there is interest, we'll pursue it. In terms of having an exploratory committee for that. And so I did have some interest, so we formed that committee a little bit different than the other ones in that they just created a case for building the parish hall first. The church and the school had 2 subcommittees each. That is, one created a case for building the school first or for building the church first, and the other subcommittee of each church and school committee created cases against. So you had 5 different cases that were presented. So from all the volunteers, we had over 30 volunteers, which I thought was a good number, listed here, and I'm grateful for their participation. From all those volunteers, we selected 4 leads, is what we called them, so try to get a decent blend of people who had indicated interest, different age groups and different backgrounds as best we could, but everybody was placed in an exploratory subcommittee or committee that they wanted to. So everyone was where they wanted to be at. If it wasn't their first choice, it was their second choice. And then I asked the leads to select a chair and then left it up to them how they wanted to run their subcommittee or committee. Meaning you could draw upon all the other people who had indicated interest, or you could keep it smaller and just the leads could run it to do your research, your analysis, your interviews, and all that stuff to create a presentation. So they worked and offered presentations on Palm Sunday, and they did a fine job, a good job. And then following that, I asked all those different committees to select one representative to come to a meeting, it was last Tuesday, to help us kind of think through things and hopefully find a way forward. So you see on the left were the ones from each of these different committees, a nice blend there. And then I asked some of our other leadership to participate as well. So Dan and Helen Biller have been involved in everything, as you know, from campaign to building committees. Dan sits on the Finance Council, so we had that group represented. Lauren Gunther is one of our young wives. She and her husband, Ben, do not yet have any children. But she works in the public school system, so I thought, well, she would be valuable to think through this with us, because she's going to have a different interest than those with children who are about to go into school, right? So I asked her. Craig Meinert, he and his wife Sarah have a few kids at Prince of Peace, so I thought that would be a helpful background too, because if we have a school, their kids probably are not going to be able to attend. So there's a portion of our population that's going to be in that situation. Craig, he's a shy guy, afterwards he said, you know, we're founding members of JPII. I sat in that meeting and I couldn't believe how many other founding members I actually didn't know. He said, with our kids at Prince of Peace, we have gotten to know the parents of kids in the grades that our kids are in. That's where our friends have developed. And I thought, now that's a helpful vantage point, right, to hear, which I'm sure you all can understand. You get to know parents who have kids in similar grades as your kids. Mike and Teresa Murphy, and Mike's business, he's been helpful as we've thought through the land, which is moving in a good direction. Teresa sits on our building committee, but also she sits on building committee at Benedictine College as they pursue building a library. Meredith Patterson is our head of operations, and Bill Weber, he also sat on this Against the School First. He gave the presentation on that. He's been a principal in a public school for a number of years, and he just completed a $30+ million project. And so I thought, well, there's a helpful vantage point, right? Someone who has that background. So I invited all of them to come to that meeting on Tuesday. And I'm grateful for their participation. So it basically ran like this. I asked them for feedback. What have you heard from people after you gave the presentations? And they, across the board, they said it was a helpful endeavor. They had a lot of positive feedback. A lot of people who came into the presentation thinking one thing and left thinking something else. Or at least it allowed people to kind of be moved outside of their bubble, or maybe their pew, as it were. Right, to see, okay, there are other interests, there are other needs in the parish that we've got to take into consideration. One of which I heard last night, I had a baptism after the presentation last night, and the dad came up to me and said, I went into the presentations thinking the school would be on the bottom of my list. And he said, I left thinking it would be on the top of my list. You know, so it was just helpful to hear the different vantage points. So then I said, okay, what are the non-negotiables? What are we not going to do without? We're not going to permit as we go forward. What has to be there? So they said, no regression. There's no more setting up and taking down chairs for weekend mass. Okay, people are just not going to accept that. Okay, no regression. A worthy worship space, not necessarily a church, but not a multi-purpose space. So the presentation on building a church first was most helpful here, I think, in that they provided a sequence of images. The first was Madison Place, the second was here, and then the third was St. Paul's multi-purpose space, which is their cafeteria, but they also have mass there on the weekends. And everybody said, we don't want that. We don't want that type of space for Mass. We don't want to have to take chairs up and down every weekend. Okay, and we said non-negotiable. We need a community space for donuts and coffee, right? And for fish fries, to eat the fish at least. All right, no frying fish in the building. All right, and then we said there's got to be sufficient space for parish offices, classrooms, and meeting rooms. This was nice. It came at the very end, like it's an afterthought. Oh, yeah, the priest needs somewhere to work, right? Okay. So there are the non-negotiables. So we began to think through, work through things. Here's the schematic for the proposed parish hall at our property at Ridgeview and 167th. Okay, so we began to think through these things with those non-negotiables in mind. So I believe there's about 650, 675 person occupancy in this area here, right? We then took into account the information provided by Sheila, who organizes our religious ed. So how many classrooms do you need? And she said, ideally, I would need 3 of the 4 multi-purpose rooms as dedicated spaces, and then the 4th as a classroom. Okay, so the 3 could be used by small groups of adults for various meetings, but would be set up permanently, for the kids. Okay? And then I said, well, we're not just going to stay the same size. We better not, right? So could you factor in just a 25% increase, right, to look out? And she said, well, if you do that, then for confirmation, you're going to need 2 classes twice a week, or you're going to use the entire building on Sunday evening. With sufficient catechists, with 25% increase, we'd use 4 classrooms 3 times per week for 150 kids, or 6 times per week for 300 kids. And we began to say, okay, with just a little growth, we're going to be out of space here. And if we got to use this, then what is that going to mean? Well, it's going to mean setting up and taking down. And we had this meeting on Tuesday when there were, I think, 3 other groups in the building meeting, and none of those groups were kids. Okay, so where are all these activities going to take place? And then we thought about, this. So you have your parish hall area that you could set up. You can probably expand over there. What would that look like for a day like today? We have donuts and coffee offered after the 7:30 Mass. Mass is normally 50 minutes, gets out at 8:20 or so. So 8:20, then what are you doing? Well, you're going from this to be able to have your coffee and donuts, and then back to that for your 9 o'clock Mass. And the rosary starts about, 8:40 or so? And then you do it again for 9 o'clock. So as we talked through that, we said, can we cross this off our list? And across the board, there were 14 people there. Everybody said, cross off the list. It doesn't meet those basic requirements. Then we moved on to the school, specifically school funding. If you're at the presentations, you heard some of this. So we have, at the beginning of this year, we had 65 students at Prince of Peace. We were on for $180,000 subsidy. So this is from the Archdiocese policy. So every child should have an opportunity of attending a Catholic school. Catholic school is a good thing. We heard one of those statistics come out in the presentation for Building the School First. Kids who go through a Catholic school are 6 times more likely to be at Mass on Sundays when they're adults. 6 times more likely to be at Mass on the weekends when they're adults than their public school counterparts. If the diocese says their home parish cannot accommodate their attendance, either because you don't have a school, you don't have enough seats in your classroom, then the parish is responsible for the difference between tuition and the per pupil cost to educate. That's called the subsidy, okay? That's just for Prince of Peace. So the Do Not Build the School First, they put this to us in their presentation. They said, okay, let's say that we have a hypothetical school of 100 students. And what they did is they gave us a $700,000 budget. They took that from Holy Trinity in Lenexa that has hundreds and hundreds of kids with a $4+ million budget, and they extrapolated it down to 100 students, knowing that you're going to have some additional costs with a smaller school. A principal, for example, can oversee 100 students or 500 students, but you still have the cost for the principal regardless of your school. So they said, taking some of that into account, you could have about a $700,000 budget. Just as a reference point for me, my previous assignment had a school K through 5 that had a $500,000 budget. It was bare bones, right? But we had students. We had more than what we have at Prince Peace. So they listed that, and it looked like, whoa, there's a big difference, right? And I didn't think of this till afterwards, but Catholic schools are funded in a way that's different than public schools. Catholic schools, the diocese said, in their guidelines, should be funded 60% by tuition, 30% by parish support, and 10% for fundraising. And so when I realized that, I think it was later that night, I thought, well, okay, here's a thought experiment. And so I started putting some questions to myself, like, okay, if parish support for 65 students is $180,000, that's 30% of the budget, what would the full budget be? All right, $600,000. If the total budget for 100 students is $700,000 in that hypothetical example, what would the subsidy be? $210,000 is what the parish support would be for that. And I said, all right, then here we have comparison, the hypotheticals, and then, all right, what would the per pupil subsidy be, which is going towards being able to compare apples to apples. So if you take subsidy divided by students, you get per pupil subsidy that we're currently paying. And then the hypothetical St. John Paul II is $2,100. Now, you notice back up here I use the word academy. There's a St. John Paul II school already in the area, and we're already getting confused with them. So I get phone calls. I got a phone call recently from a mom who said, our daughter goes to your school. She loves it, and we love your school, and we'd like to join your parish. And I said, well, hey, we love Catholic education, but, all right, if we have 65 at Prince Peace, we have 65, if we had 100, what would our parish subsidy be using those numbers? How does that compare against the hypothetical St. John Paul II? Well, if we begin to compare apples to apples, 100 to 100, the cost parish subsidy would actually be less for us. So you're going to see some of the emotion come out in this conclusion that I'm typing out, like, wait a second, for 100 students, we'd be paying $67,000 more per year to educate our kids at Prince Peace than if we did it ourselves. And we'd have families leave like we have because we don't have a parish school. We've had 13 families of those who are sending their kids to Prince Peace leave in the last 2 years. And that doesn't account for all the families who have called looking in advance for their kids to enter into a school, which is probably twice that number, right? So we would then also lose, of course, that community building dynamic of which Craig spoke. So then I asked just a couple other questions. So maybe you're thinking 700,000 is too small. If we had 100 students at the Prince Peace subsidy, what would our budget be? That would be our budget if we had 100 students and we were paying the subsidy that we're paying to Prince of Peace per pupil cost. Maybe you're asking, can we afford it? Well, here's just one way that you can think through it. Right now, we have $90,000 in rent per year, annual rent for this building. We're not going to have this building when we have someplace new. This is going up 3% in October. So you take 180,000. We have a couple families at a couple other Catholic schools that amounts to 9,000 plus this, and you see, well, yeah, even right now, that's financially doable for us. All right, so last question I put to myself, well, we're supposed to grow, right? The diocese is saying about 2,500, so we're at 30% of future families. So that means that the future enrollment is about 217. If we take our per pupil subsidy right now that we pay average to Prince of Peace times 217, what's our annual subsidy going to be? $601,000 a year that we'd send to another place. Do you see it? And then you can see why so many places have a hard time starting a school once they have expanded their population, because when you start a school, you got to anticipate that a lot of the kids are still going to go to that school. They're not going to switch over immediately. So you've got that cost in addition to your startup costs for your own school, right? You see the heavy lift that would be involved. So we went through all of that, and we thought, okay, so like St. Michael's, they built a dedicated worship space in their future gym and appointed it nicely. So pews, altar, and other furnishings. So we said, well, what about that? You know, that would begin to check all the different boxes that we need, right? And Bill Weber asked the question, what about phasing something in, which is really ironic. Now here I have to give you just a little bit of background. So he's one at the school, right, the principal of the school, and he knows from projects, sometimes you do that. So here's a little bit of background that I shared with the group at this time. It's really unusual in the circumstances. So we're pursuing land. It's very promising. We look to close at the end of May. Okay, so everything is proceeding in that direction. In order to go through the due diligence period for the land, we need to involve a civil engineer. But to involve a civil engineer, you need to involve an architect. Okay, civil engineer is not going to tell you, what footprint your buildings are, what the layout is. That's what your architect is going to do. So we needed to involve an architect. All of this has to be still confidential. I still can't tell you where the land is at, which is a really unusual circumstance. So I invited several leaders in to interview architects. We didn't choose the architect that we had utilized for the initial plans at Ridgeview 167th for a couple of reasons. One is I've gotten to know a man, professor at Benedictine College, who is known nationwide for his specialization in church architecture. And he said he would be glad to consult with us for free if we choose an architect that is trained in sacred architecture, church architecture, classical architecture, which ours was not. You can look at his portfolio. His specialty was just not designing churches. So we interviewed 4 from the short list that this man at Benedictine gave. And we selected one. They were all very good. We selected one who's excellent, going to be great to work with. But part of his experience and specialization is in phasing in projects. Okay, this is not our church. Let me just be clear about that. Okay, this is a project they're working on currently in the desert Southwest. Okay, so there's the drawing of the overall campus. Here are the considerations they're making. This is the basic footprint, a traditional cruciform shape of the church. Basic, but their consideration is, do we build the nave first, or do we build the sanctuary first? Because it is possible to phase in a church. Do you see that? I'll show you. So other options they considered, well, how about if we do a shorter nave or a longer nave, and we leave these segments to later? And what would that look like? Well, here's a rendering of the sanctuary with a shorter nave, and all that you would do, I say all, but what you would do is remove the facade when it comes time to expand your church, and there's your church. And you can do something similar on the inside in terms of ornamentation, decor. Right, so here's a sketch of what the final product would look like, but that's not where you have to start. And he said, now please know that it wouldn't be gray walls and such like that, but this gives you an idea of beginning simply and then over time, adding in your ornamentation as funds permit and as the parish grows. So then our consideration next was, well, what about a church? Okay, this is a schematic of St. Paul's. They're going to build soon, right? So they're in the midst of their campaign. This church would be a little bit larger than what we would need. You can't build a church for the current population, right? You have to build it ultimately for what you project. Not 750 families, but 2,500 families. Theirs is a little bit larger. I think it would seat 1,300. We would need somewhere around 900 or 1,000, something like that. So there's the upper level, and there's the lower level, where they would have their great parish hall, kitchen, meeting rooms, offices, and such, all in one place. And we discussed, well, what if you just did a portion of the church, phased it in? Well, then we wouldn't check the boxes on some of our non-negotiables. We wouldn't have some office space or meeting room spaces, right? Or a hall. So then the only other option was you do the whole thing. But you do the whole thing, and you're talking, they're like somewhere around 24 million. And they have 3,000 families. We have 750. That would be an extraordinarily heavy lift for all of us. So as we got through all of that, then it was the most extraordinary meeting I've ever been a part of in this respect. You had 14 people from very different vantage points. People going in, I want this, or I'm arguing against this. And there was unanimous consent recommendations that emerged. The first was prioritize the academy. That checks offices, classrooms, and a cafeteria so you can have your coffee and donuts after Mass. And then construct phase one of the church or a gym with a dedicated space if phase one of the church isn't feasible. Okay, that was their recommendation. Now, since then, well, they wanted me to ask the architect, could you give us a ballpark on what, this first phase might be? And I knew the answer because he's going to ask, well, what kind of roof do you want? This type or this type, right? That's only, $500,000 difference. Or do you want stone or do you want brick? Oh, that's only $1 million difference, right? So I knew his answer, but here's the deal. He said, you're going to build a church that's going to last 100 years. That's what Catholics do. We're not fly-by-night places, right? You're going to construct that. You construct the bare bones of your first phase, right, to last 100 years. That is approximately the same building cost, per square foot building cost, as a gym. Because a gym has certain requirements. If you're going to build a full-size gym, you can only build this size because you've got basketball courts and et cetera that's going to eventually come. So then for me, the only question is, well, do you build the nave first, or do you build the sanctuary area first? Right? I don't think that the majority of people would say, let's build a gym with a dedicated worship space instead of building your permanent church, part of your permanent church, right? The recommendations here, they're fascinating to think about. It captures the broadest cross-section of the parish possible, if you think about it, right? There are some people here who have, kids maybe in high school or college, who are not going to benefit from an academy, but they might be thinking, my kids are not wholly unattractive and they're not total screw-ups, so they might get married one day, right? And I prefer that they get married in a church than in a gym that's nicely appointed. So you're able to capture that. You're able to capture families who have small children that want to go to an academy, homeschoolers who need a place to meet for CGS. But they said we've got to have benchmarks, okay? So that means we've got to establish that there's viable enrollment for an academy. Not K through 8 to be in with. Typically schools roll out like K through 3 or so. So we've got to establish there's viable enrollment, that those families are going to be participating. It's not we build a school and you come. It's we build together, right? And then we have to have a feasibility study. Okay, so I have already forwarded this all on to the Archbishop. Here are recommendations. And I sent an advance copy to Father Riley, the Chancellor, who we know from his time here. And he said it looks very likely, of course, that he'll approve this. And then he's already gotten the ball rolling with the superintendent regarding the future academy. So, I have to say a word about this very, very quickly. Put on my administrator's cap, my serious person's cap here. If we're going to build an academy, we build one that has the Catholic worldview integrated into it completely. Some of you may be concerned because there are some places that have a Catholic school, and the majority of families who attend the school do not attend Mass on weekends. That's an extraordinary scandal. I experienced that when I went to my former assignment. I didn't see a majority of families at Mass. I didn't see them participating in other events, even the fundraisers for the school. And I said, look here, these are your investors out here. What they're investing in is a Catholic education. And you're not getting a Catholic education if you can't keep the basic commandments, right? Who would want to support a school that's saying, it's not a big deal if you're not at Mass? Well, is it not a big deal if you steal, or you lie, or you don't honor your parents, right? So what I'm saying is all these different elements have to be in place. They will be in place. So let me pledge that to the investors here. Faith that provides the larger narrative. Why am I here? What's life about? Into which is situated all that's done in the classroom. So Catholic school is much greater than a cross on the wall and prayer said in the classroom. And then as anyone knows, like if you study piano, unless you begin to play piano, you don't really know piano. So unless you begin to live it, right, you're not getting Catholic education. So all those have to be placed. Now what you see in these slides is actually a school that our architect has designed, and they're breaking ground any day on. Now, of course, let me get to the very end and just anticipate that some people might be wondering, when is this going to happen? Right, when is this? So the key point is if funding is in place. If funding is in place. You heard in one of the presentations that like 30 to 40% participation is anticipated in capital campaigns. That's inconceivable for me, right? Because none of us are here by accident, but God has chosen us to be here, right? And so if he has chosen us to be here, he anticipates that we are here, that we're involved in this. He has elected us to do this work. It's way more significant than if your country said to you, we need you, right, in this moment, so volunteer, right? It's inconceivable to me that 40% participation would be our goal or be our operative mentality, right? Who of us wouldn't want to stand before God at the end of our life on Judgment Day and hear him say, well, you had several missed opportunities, but you didn't miss the opportunity at St. John Paul II. Well done, good servant, right? So if God expects everyone to participate, who are we to anticipate that everyone would not participate? Makes sense, does it not? Yes? It makes sense. So if funding is in place, what kind of timeline can we talk about? Here we are, April 2023. It will take about 8 months to do all the designs. That is for the entire campus, all the way down to construction documents. Okay, 8 months of working. Now, we have a real advantage here with our patron, because the architects typically will take people and go to different churches. In the area, Oklahoma, they might take us or go with us to Krakow, and we look at all these different churches, and we'd come up with an idea for ours. But that could work, but it takes time to explain that. Oh, here's a church that kind of looks like the one that St. John Paul II was at as a child. But when you hear St. John Paul II, everyone thinks immediately of St. Peter's. And so what we thought is, let's take that as our design cue, our thematic cue. Not as though we're going to build St. Peter's, but you can take design elements like the piazza, for example, that could be used as your entryway to the church or to your green space, right? Or maybe you build up the area around the back of the church like a little village instead of just a building here and a parking lot here and a building here and a parking lot there, right? This would allow us and will allow us, if you're open to it, to leapfrog many months. We'll start there. Of course, we'll have lots of discussions on finalizing things, but that would give us a real advantage and a clear connection. So 8 months is what the architect said, if funding is there for the design, 14 months for the completion of the academy, a couple months to occupy it. And he said this depends on your contractor. If they're large enough, he said you can do both projects at the same time. If they're not, then it'll be spaced out a little bit. Best case scenario, August 2025 for the completion of these phases, which is not far away. But that's going to depend on these elements up here. If I have to go to your front door with my hat in hand, that's going to take longer in order for us to succeed. So, those are the recommendations that came. Are you good with it? Does that seem like a way forward? Like of all the alternatives out there, it seemed to us, this is the best option. It hits every portion of the parish, does it not? Yes? Good. I think so too. I told this to the architect, and he said, I've never heard of a meeting go like that at a parish. Never once in all my time. He said, that's divine intervention, to be able to have all these different groups organized around this mission. So, I say stay tuned. We have a lot coming in the future weeks and months. All right? Yes? All right. Good.